kick us off, Mr. Gokul.
Great. Hi all, thanks for coming by this session. We know that this is the last session that you guys might be going through, but hopefully you had a fun week. And this session is about integration best practices. And my name is Gokul Ramesh, and I'm part of the Solution Architect team, which is an extension of R&D. And I have my colleague here, Paul.
Hi, everyone. My name is Paul Wu. If you haven't seen me or my session yet, I'm very surprised because I've done already 5-6 sessions. Yeah, happy to see you guys. Yeah. Let's do it.
So in terms of the topics, we'll be talking about integration technologies. These technologies could be within D365 for operations or anything external to D365, right? And also we'll go through some of the scenarios that we have gone through as SA team and some of the best practices we have found out of it. So how many have you seen this slide? Okay, few of you, okay. So when we met this time last year, we had like around maybe 10 or 15 TAP customers who went through this journey of implementing D365. And since then, we have 100 customers in production, and we have a lot more customers who are part of the ongoing implementation, and we also have some people in pipeline. So our experience here is with all the customers in production and the customers that are going through the journey, and some of them in the early life cycle of sales. So in terms of service endpoints, so AIF is gone, and AIF is now replaced with OData service. And we also had like document services and metadata and query-based services. While the metadata and query-based services are technically gone, these are replaced by OData service. So we have a metadata service for through OData, and we also have a query service. We have full suite of REST-based operations. So in terms of authentication, in AX 2012, it was all simple. It was all on-prem. And with D365, we moved to cloud. And when we moved to the cloud, our identity manager changed. And now our identity manager is Azure AD. So typically what happens is, for example, when a client is trying to, let's say, log into AX, or I'm a user, I'm going through a browser session, and I want to log into D365, right? So when this request comes to D365, D365 doesn't know who I am. It's like, I don't know Gokul. So the D365 will reroute that to Azure AD, and Azure AD knows who is Gokul, and he works with Microsoft. So it issues back a SAML token to the client, and then the client, for any future request, goes to D365 with that particular token. So each of the web requests will have a token embedded. So now operations will know that, oh, I know this token, it's issued by AAD, and I trust, right? So that's the entire authentication story. And when we talk about authentication, it could be user accessing D365 with a web client or a mobile client, and then the other scenario we have is integration. So for the web and the mobile client, they can, it's similar process. In terms of what the client is sending to AAD is their username and basically the credentials. But for any integrations, we could use something called as client ID. So you would go to AAD and register D365 as an app, and you get a client ID with the secret token. So in all your integrations, you can use this client ID and the secret token to get authenticated. until fall release, we just had a username and the password-based authentication, but then we realized that once you have the username and password, any applications on AAD is accessible. So to reduce the risk, now we enable client ID and the secret ID-based authentication. So that means whoever has these two keys, they only have access to AX. So they don't have any access to application outside operations that's sitting in AAD. So in terms of integration, so data entity is in the heart of any integration. So any data that is coming out of AX or going into going into operations are through data entity. So on a very high level, we have the data management platform, which is similar to what you had in AX 2012 from a concept standpoint. And we also have the OData endpoint, which is more like a services endpoint. So even though both of these technologies use entity, underneath the hood, initially they take a different code path. So DIXF, any call through DIXF, initially DIXF will read the file, populate the staging table, and then push it to the target. So with the OData, the data is going directly to target. So the APIs on the entity that are related from like get data to staging, those are the APIs that are not called on OData service. Rest of the APIs that you have in entity, like a post load method or a init value, so all those methods will get called in both the mechanism. Okay, when we talk about integration, in terms of pattern, very high level, we usually see two kind of options. One is real-time pattern, and the other one is asynchronous pattern. So real-time pattern is anything that you want to look up, you want the information immediately. So I'm creating a sales order, and D365 for operations has the pricing on an item, right? So that's a real-time lookup that I want to get the pricing, or any tax calculation, right? Asynchronous is like a nightly credit card data, or it could be your payroll data once in a 2 week, or anything that is scheduled on a recurrence pattern. So personally, we like the asynchronous pattern because both the both the systems or applications that need to communicate are decoupled. So for example, if you take like CRM is publishing a message, and if operations is down, this message gets queued up, and once the operation is back, it will process the message. Similar way, if operations is sending something to CRM, so it's the very nature of it being decoupled. And also, in terms of asynchronous pattern, we use DIXF. So as you guys know, DIXF can read, when it reads the file, it spins up individual tasks for each of the file, and it is backed by SSIS. So the file, reading the file and pushing it to the staging, it's really fast, right? And from then, you can go through the validation, and again, it depends what sort of validations you want. You can enable them, and it's pushed to target. So it's just that it's more scalable, right? But we also get that there are some business requirements in terms of it being real time. So for any real time integration, you could use OData, which is based on the REST API, and you can write your own custom service. And for asynchronous pattern, we have DIXF. So now we'll go through certain patterns that we have seen from our implementations, and we'll kind of go through a decision tree, how we kind of determine whether it is a real-time or a asynchronous pattern, right? So this particular scenario, it's an inventory lookup. So they had an on-prem scheduler system, which basically looks at how we can schedule maintenance job and who needs to go where to perform that maintenance. So while they schedule, they also want to know for that maintenance if there is any raw material that is required. So all the raw materials are held within D365 for operations. So they need to know if this particular inventory is available before they confirm the maintenance, right? So it's a quick lookup. And so what do you guys think the pattern should be here? Synchronous, okay. Okay, so before we confirmed, we went through, this is very high level tree structure, so you can add more to it based on what you're seeing with your customer. So at a very high level, is this really a real-time requirement? So in this case, yes, because they wanted to confirm whether that maintenance person could go on and carry out that work on such and such time. So the next question you need to ask is the volume high? So in this case, the volume was low. And what's the frequency? Whether is it happening every 5 minutes, every half an hour, or 1 hour, or ad hoc, right? So in this case, it was ad hoc, so we went with the OData real-time pattern. Okay, the second scenario, too quick, Paul. So now they know the answer. So the second scenario we had here is around a specialty retailer. So this particular customer, they only sell to like friends and family, and they call them sales champion. And sales champions are responsible to further sell it down the stream. So they had a really good front-end order-taking mechanism, which is a PHP web-based application. So they really didn't want to replace that experience for their salespeople, right? So they create sales order, and this sales order needs to be then pushed to operations, right? So what do you think the pattern should be here? Okay, let's go. So when we went through the requirement, we found that it's a critical business requirement because in terms of it being synchronous, because as soon as they create a sales order, they would like to confirm immediately whether the inventory is available and confirm the sales order, right? We are like, okay, so the next question is this volume high? So they said the volume is relatively low because they are in specialty business. So I think the volume was like 100 sales order per hour or less than that. And the frequency is ad hoc, so it depends. So in this case, since the volume was very low, we were like, okay, we can go ahead and implement the real-time OData pattern. So this is an interesting scenario. This customer is upgrading from AX 2012 to D365. So they have a conveyor belt, and they have boxes going through the conveyor belt, and they have a scanner which scans the boxes. And then when it scans, it needs to send this information to operations, and operations need to get a packing slip printed on a printer, which they could then paste it and ship it out. So the one other requirement was this has to be done in 30 seconds by the time the box is scanned to the packing slip being printed. So in AX 2012, they had certain tables on SQL. Once the scanner punched it, they created a record, and then they had certain batch jobs to identify what were the new records, and they processed it. So to achieve the 30-second time limit, so usually if you see in like AX 2012, the batch job, when you schedule, it's minimum 1 minute. So they created a batch job at the top of a minute, and they, for every the next 5 seconds, they scheduled a new batch. So that's how they were able to achieve it. So now that everything is on cloud, it's more interesting. So, sorry. So what do you think the pattern is? Asynchronous, synchronous? What would you recommend? Synchronous, okay. But the volume is high, right? So yes, so this is a real-time requirement, but the volume is high, and the frequency was ad hoc. So in this case, our recommendation is for you to do a performance benchmark before you agree on it's a real-time integration. So typically, as part of your subscription, you get a sandbox. So if this customer doesn't have a lot of integration, then you can do a benchmark in sandbox environment. If not, we have certain SKUs that you can run performance testing on. It could be like T3 or T4. And with the new licensing option, if you go through volume licensing, you have to procure an environment for minimum of a year, I guess. But now we also have a MPSA option wherein a customer can procure environments based on minimum 2 months or something like that. So you could use potentially this environment for performance testing and UAT, right? So the main recommendation here is go through the performance benchmark, and that's what we did for this customer before we approved that they can use a synchronous pattern. So in terms of one additional scenario here, this customer is a mobile insurance company. So they do insurance for most of the mobiles that are sold in US. So they have an on-prem application where the sales order is created, where the order is taken and stored, right? And they have D365 for operations, and they want to sync these sales orders to operations so that they can further track it, and they have services component against that in operation. So in terms of pattern, like this is really high volume, so what's your recommendation? Async, okay. Yeah, so when we spoke to the business, they were like, all our order taking and everything can be done in their on-prem solution. So there was no real requirement that it had to be synchronous. So as I said, the volume was very high because they service most of the insurance requirement for all the carriers within US or the mobile. So the frequency for now, we agreed it is every 5 minutes. They were okay if they want to go like 10 minutes or 15 minutes. That was not a real concern. But from what we have seen, 5 minutes works okay. I think they had like 10 or 20K orders per hour or more than that. Okay. So the more we are getting on the cloud, the more kind of scenarios that we are seeing where D365 needs to talk to all these applications on-prem. I think we missed the slide, Paul. There was an initial slide on Logic Apps and BizTalk.
Oh, it's after. I put it in.
Oh, you moved it? Okay. Sorry. I wanted to talk about that slide, so that would have made sense for you here, but anyways. So we are seeing a lot of these requirements where D365 from cloud needs to talk to this all on-prem devices which go through web services. So this particular customer, they have a PLM system. This PLM system has it's a product lifecycle management system, so it has all their in items and BOM. And for this particular customer, that's their bread and butter. So they are very close about this data not being available to anyone, right? So they didn't even want to expose this web service on a public domain. So we're like, okay, security is the biggest requirement for them. So we have two options within Azure. One is the Azure Application Proxy and the API management. So for this customer, we ended up using Azure Application Proxy. So what Azure Application Proxy lets you do is it lets you secure your on-prem web services. So there is a connector that's installed on an on-prem device, and this connector is used by Azure AAD to authenticate and then talk to on-prem. So you don't have to punch firewalls to enable this web service on public domain, right? And if you have attended yesterday's session, we went deep in terms of discussing how you would implement these two patterns. So if not, you can take a look at the video recording. So as I said, they wanted a secured service. So okay, and this scenario is around something similar, but in a different way. So we usually see that from D365, you want to generate a bank file format and send it to the bank, and this needs to happen in a secured fashion, right? So we have a slide later to discuss how we achieve this. Okay, so all the patterns that we went through before most of them are inbound patterns, and for outbound patterns, we have data warehousing. So with D365, we have two concepts. One is entity store, and the other concept is bring your own database. So we wanted to kind of highlight entity store because with D365, as you might have seen, there are multiple databases, and entity store is one of them, which customer gets it for free as part of their subscription. So entity store is mainly used for Power BI reporting, and we only let you push D365 data into entity store, and the scenario here is lighting up Power BI reports or dashboards. So the way you do is you have something called as aggregated measures. You schedule these aggregated measures. You want to refresh every 10 minutes, 15 minutes. And so an aggregated measure, if you're comparing it with the X2012, think about it as a sales cube or a purchase cube or an inventory cube. So the cubes are replaced with the aggregated measure, and this is what you get to push to entity store. And quite often I get this question, why did you guys name it to entity store while you are not letting us push entities to the entity store? So the answer is the aggregated measure that you are building in a regular entity can be a data source within an aggregated measure. So aggregated measure is just a star schema, right? And the advantages that we are getting out of entity store is the Power BI can go direct SQL against entity store, and the report refresh is much faster. I don't know if anyone has used Power BI with the OData option. when we went RTW and update 1, until then we had OData mechanism to refresh your Power BI reports. Seems like none of you have used, which is good. That's fine. You haven't gone through the pain, but now we have entity store. So the other concept we have is bring your own database. And as you guys know, like you no more have access to production. Everything is on cloud, and the production access is locked down, and we manage everything for you. So that means there is some data that might be required for integration that downstream systems need. And so how do we expose this data, right? So for that, we have a connector to bring your own database. What it means is bring your own database is a SQL Azure database that is based out of your subscription. So you have full access to this database. You pay for it. You have complete T-SQL access, everything. And so we let you push entities from D365 to this database that you are hosting. And the way we do is we let you schedule these entities. And we have two options. You can do full push, incremental push. And then once you have the data in your bring your own database, you are responsible for that data, and you can then get your downstream systems to talk to the SQL Azure and consume the data. Okay, in terms of, sorry, go ahead. Yeah. No, it's a schedule. It's async. Okay, sorry. So the question is, what is the frequency between the data entity being pushed from D365 to bring your own database? So this is based on a batch recurring job. So you get to decide what that frequency should be. And our recommendation is based on what you're doing, whether it's a full push or an incremental push. If it is incremental push, you need to analyze how much data you need to push and then schedule it based on that. So I'll cover one more thing when we discuss tricks and tips. Yeah. So behind the scenes, SSIS is doing this. So it's grabbing data from D365 and pushing it to bring your own database. So as you know, SSIS is really fast. So in terms of volume, you need to do a benchmark and see what works for you. The reason I'm saying is if you have certain code on entity that needs to get executed before the data is pushed, then there is a bottleneck there. So it's not only what SSIS can do, it's pre and post. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
We've done an assessment about the pre-go database.
Yeah.
Faced with the fact that we're going to have to produce about 150 custom data instances to make our cubes good for our BI system. Have you got anything that can help us with that scenario? Because it's a big output for us to actually produce 150 data custom.
Okay. To rephrase the question, you have a customer who has 150 entities that they want to push to bring your own database, and you want certain recommendations specific for this customer. So you can come meet us after the call, and we would definitely, after our discussion, we would definitely help you out. We can go through general tips and tricks, and we also have a lot of customers who are using this in production. And we had some challenges, and we have overcome them. So in terms of scenarios, even though you have incremental push, the incremental push only works for newly created data and updated data. So if you delete something and you have an incremental push, let's say you had a vendor entity that you have created a recurrence pattern to push your data on an incremental fashion. So if there is any new vendor created or any vendor updated, then the incremental push will take care of it. So if you go ahead and delete a vendor in operations, so as of today, the incremental push will not go and delete that in bring your own database. So this is something we are working on. So we should have something to cater the delete scenario in fall release. So for now, if this is a real need for your customer, the only option you have is full push. So the only issue with full push is before the full push happens, it deletes all the data in your bring your own database, and then it reflushes it. So that brings to the second interesting point. So if you have downstream systems that are pulling on bring your own database to get the data, so if it is going through a full push cycle, when it's reading, it might be like when the full push is processing the data, your downstream system is getting half picture, or while it is going through the process, it could be like 90% or 80%, right? So so for these scenarios, like you have two options. One is if it is not a real critical need, so you can do a full push once a day so that the data gets flushed, and throughout the day you can do incremental push. So that way, if something got deleted during the day, it's then updated in your database next day, right? Then the other thing you could do is there are certain jobs that can be exposed to, or we can push that data into BYODB. So we have a DIXF jobs, and we have entities on those jobs, right? So if you push this data in an incremental fashion, any of your downstream system before reading the data, they can just check this job status, whether the job status is in process or it's completed. If it is completed, then it's a suitable time to consume the data. And in terms of security, currently we are not pushing any security from operations to bring your own database. So you own that data and you have SQL access and all kinds of access. It's your own database. Okay, in terms of big picture, quite often what happens is when you go through these patterns, when you're looking at individual integrations, it seems like, okay, it's a real business need and the volume is low. And what happens is once you have a bunch of requirements, and individually they might seem like a real-time pattern is fine, but you put them together, then you see like you have tons of integration all going through a real-time pattern. So you need to assess the overall architecture, and then based on what you see, our recommendation is to, if you have a lot of integrations, then do a performance benchmark, and also try to push, if there is no real need to be synchronous pattern, try to push it for asynchronous pattern, which is more scalable and performant. And in terms of load balancing, our suggestion is if you have integrations, then look at each integration, kind of scheduling them so that they don't step over each other. So kind of expand the schedule and try to minimize the overlaps.
Can you go through it one more time? You can load balance on if you're doing multiple entities.
Yeah.
So what if you have data warehouse that's going to refresh? It's going to
So a nightly feed is fine, but during the day when users are using the system, be careful that you don't have all the jobs running at the same point so that users are facing slowness in their browser session or what. Again, the nightly jobs, think if you can sequence it and so that it is more performant. But again, nightly jobs are usually fine.
Yep. Just a quick thing to add to that is when we talk about a synchronous approach and asynchronous approach, the synchronous approach, one big difference there behind the scene is the async job actually runs on the batch server, while the OData synchronous traffic hits your user interactive server.
Yeah.
So if like Goku was saying, if you just look at each individual case, it's like, yeah, its volume is super small, so no worries, we'll go against the UI interactive server. That could add up, right? So we're just saying, make sure you're not doing, or if you can spread them out, so that's what, by load balancing, that's what we mean. If we can spread these integration out so they don't happen at the same time, just make sure you have that in the back of your mind when you design your integration.
What you said was that if it's async, it's less of a constraint because it's coming off of a different copy of the data. Is that correct? Or it's a different, you said it, when if it's sync, it stayed the same. OData was in the live system. Correct. And then async, it sounded like you said was a different.
A batch server. So just like in 2012, right? You have different LS servers. Some of these servers are for handling UI sessions. Some of these servers you use for batch, right? Same thing happens in operations. If you go through the real-time OData integration, all that integration is going to hit the UI interactive servers. And then for batch job, you can absolutely allocate some dedicated batch servers to do a batch job. So if you're coming through, say through a file, all that traffic is going to go through the batch server, which does have zero impact on your UI interactive server in terms of the service tier. I mean, ultimately, it's going to hit your database, so it does have impact, but.
So all the recurring job that will run based out of your batch server, all the asynchronous calls. Sorry. Yeah, so we had a session this morning. So you can use bundling. So with the bundling works only with the asynchronous option. So you can decide for a particular entity based on the records how many tasks you want to process that particular data parallelly. So you can define for every 10,000 records, I want 10 parallel tasks, right? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Not here. All the real-time calls are going through Azure load balancer. And so there is some amount of load balancing, but Azure load balancing is also based on IP affinity and few other things.
Is it a predictive thing? And does it change by its own? Is there any enhancement in that load balancer?
So you don't have an option to modify the load balancer. There is an algorithm behind it, and in most of the scenarios, it's based on the IP affinity. So you would see some pattern there where you can say that, oh, this is always going through this, and this is the response time that you're getting for that particular integration. Any more questions? Sorry, Paul.
Just going to add, the Azure Load Balancer, it sits at the lowest level, right? So it knows which server, which one of your LS VM, essentially. It's busy, and it's going to do its job.
Okay. Next slide. Okay, in terms of tips and tricks for OData, so whenever you are doing a OData call, use post-only set properties. So what it does is, whenever you are doing a OData call, let's say, for example, sales order, when I go to the UI and create a sales order, minimum I need a sales order ID, which might be automatically generated, and I need a customer and few other fields. So the same thing, if you do on a OData call and you don't use this property, it will come back and tell you that, hey, the address is null, this field is null, that field is null. So so it is not defaulting all the things that you have mentioned. So the reason being, if you don't use this property, it's expecting you to explicitly send those properties when you do a call. So just keep in mind if you run into any issues where the field value is null. And the second thing here is batch with single chain set. So this option guarantees a transaction scope, and by transaction scope, what we mean is there might be scenarios like you are publishing 500 records at a given time, and any one of these records fail, then you want to kind of undo the entire thing. Also, for example, sales order scenario. So I have a sales order, a header entity and a line entity. I create a header, and which goes fine, but on the line, there is an item that you have mentioned on the line is not available in D365. So in this scenario, you want to undo the sales order header creation, right? So what you can do here is use this property on your context.save, and what this will guarantee you is if there is an error in any one of the record, it will roll back the entire transaction. And one other property we didn't list here is, in some instances, one is if you call a header and line separately without the batch property, it is two different HTTP call to D365. If you do a batch, then both the entity call is just it's combined into one HTTP call and sent to AX. So if you have hundreds of records that you are inserting, then our recommendation is for you to batch so that it goes into D365 as one HTTP call. And again, you also have one additional property here, batch with independent operation. So if you send the property batch with individual operations, then even though your HTTP call is batched, let's say you send 500 customers, right? And even if one customer fails, you don't want to undo the remaining 499 customers, right? So in that case, you can still batch the call, but use an independent operation. That way, the only customer that got failed will not be created. Rest of them would be created in D365. And the next thing here is OData doesn't. Sorry, go ahead.
So in case of batch, if an error has occurred when batch is failed, so how the error message will be returned? So let's say you send.
So you'll get a 400 message back. In terms of OData, we don't currently support dynamic array, and one of the areas that we use dynamic array in the product is around timesheets. So remember how timesheet has hours, which is from, let's say, Sunday to Saturday or Monday to Sunday, whatever thing. So if you see at the table level, it's just one field called hours, but it's using a dynamic array, and you would mention hours, like I spent 8 hours on Monday, so you would split that hours based on hours, bracket 1, 2, 3, 4, and then that's assuming that it's on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, right? So recommendation here is from fall release, we have released a mobile app which uses the timesheet new framework where you can enter timesheet from the mobile. So similarly, our plan is to provide you an entity on top of this mobile framework. So what happens is you just publish your hours through the entity, and this is a flat table where you publish the hours, and there is a timesheet service which reads the data and creates actual timesheet in D365. And the last thing here is the header and line pattern. So as I said, right now, if you're doing any of the OData call in a header and line scenario, in terms of number sequence, the examples that we had previously put out there is based on you sending the sales order number or any document number. So we can also generate the number sequence. So if you want a D365 sales ID or any of the document ID, you can call the number sequence service and you can assign the ID before you post this operation. So we will, I'll put up this example in end of next week in GitHub, so you can watch out for that. And also in header and line pattern, look at persistency. So as I said, if you use the single chain set, then you have a transaction guarantee whether when the sales line fails, then the header is rolled back. There might be some scenarios where you're still okay to create the sales order header. So in that case, just be sure of the sequence in terms of ordering these entities. Okay, we spoke about OData, and we'll talk about a recurring job, right? This is the asynchronous pattern. So the first step is delete all your old messages. So what happens with recurrence job is whenever you enqueue a file, this particular file is put on a blob storage, and DIXF is reading this message from a blob storage. So as and when you start pushing those files, those get queued up in the blob storage. So our recommendation is clean up every 30 days or whatever your cadence is. So right now, we don't have an easy mechanism to clean up these messages. It's a bit cumbersome. So we should have a hotfix in next week or so for you to easily clean up these messages. And, sorry, go ahead. Yeah. Yeah. So if you go to the, not the staging table. We are talking about the individual files that get queued up on the blob. So for staging table, we still have the clean staging table option. Yeah. Not right now. You can put a connect request for that, so it will go into the backlog. But yeah, good point. We can. So in AX 2012, let's say if you had 10 companies and you wanted to implement the asynchronous pattern, so you had two options. Either schedule the job in 10 companies and create whatever 5 folders for each company in process, processing, and whatever error. So, and this is cumbersome to manage, but with D365, you can schedule one batch job, and whenever you enqueue the file, you can mention what company it needs to be published in, and that's all you need to do, and it's taken care, and the message will be processed in that company. And in terms of export, right now, most of our standard entities, so an entity will assist you both with import and export. So by default, this entity is company-specific nature. So in your customer requirements, you might see that they want all of the customers from different companies as one export. If you have to do it, then you would have to schedule, let's say if you have 10 companies, 10 jobs to export this data. So the other trick you can do here is you can develop your own entity, and on the entity there is a property called company context, which is usually set to the data area ID, so you can remove that. That means that this entity can now see data across the companies. But the only other thing you have to do with this entity is it becomes only, you have to set the property read-only. So the reason being, if you don't have read-only property set, then assumption is this entity can be used to push data into D365. So right now we don't have a mechanism for an entity to push data into multiple companies. So it needs to come from the message and not from the entity. Again, look at the volume, and if it makes sense, you can modify this your own entity to get this data out. And once you have this property set, then you can just schedule one job in any company. It doesn't matter. It will bring data from all the company. And then the other interesting property that we have or we ship out of box is process messages in order. So remember we had the mobile insurance scenario where they were creating the sales order. So let's say they created, initially the customer service took a sales order, and in this case it's a mobile insurance, so the customer is, okay, I'll go with the $200 deductible plan. And then soon after the call, the customer is, I don't want such a high deductible. I'll go for a $100 deductible. So they call back and they say, okay, I want to change this order. I want a $100 deductible. So the service rep changes that order, but now in your queue, there are two orders, one for $200 deductible for the same sales order, and there is a recent sales order with $100 deductible. So when these messages get processed using DIXF, so right now, by default, it spins up a thread for each file, and each file is processed parallelly. So that means whichever process completes would be what is in operations. So for example, whichever operation gets completed last will be the latest data in D365. So for example, let's say the sales order, the second sales order got processed first and the first sales order got processed later. So that means the order you have in operations is for $200 deductible, but in your on-prem database, you have a $100 deductible plan or an item for the same sales order. So to tackle this, we have this feature called process message in order. So it will honor the timestamp based on the way you have queued up the message. So it will go through sequentially. So again, if this is a real critical business requirement and based on the nature of data that you are seeing, then this is something you would have to use. And because of the requirement, you might lose the parallel processing option. And the last trick here is around bundling. I think somebody asked this question. So yeah, you can spin up multiple batch tasks based on a record count or any based on an entity and a record count. You can have different thresholds. So we spoke about in some detail in this morning's session on data management. So if you have time, you can go through that session once the video is available. Okay. Okay, Paul will take over from here.
Okay. This scenario is a weird scenario. Essentially, it's a bank payment file. Sorry. As we all know, the bank payment file is not in a tabular data format, right? It's not in regular fields. Apologize. So for anything that's structured in tabular format, like master data, any kind of business document, sales orders, your regular data, please do use our DIXF entity when you do integrations. Right? If this is real time, use the OData service endpoints. If this is file-based, use the DIXF import enqueue and dequeue jobs. But for this particular one, the scenario is basically when you generate a check, the out-of-the-box experiences, the user will Obviously, only the user with the right security role will be able to generate the check. But when you do generate the check, we'll prompt you to say download the check. So the person will actually have physical access to that generated, not check, payment file, sorry, payment file. This particular customer says, no, I do not trust my account payable clerk, so I'm going to, I don't want no human interaction with this bank payment file. Therefore, I want X to send directly this file, save it somewhere else, and then I want to write some other service to grab it and send it to my bank. All right? No UI interaction whatsoever. So the requirement, if I shorten it to a requirement, is being able to export a non-tabular format file somewhere and save it somewhere so that another process can have access to it. Such scenario is quite easy to do in 2012, right? Because you have access to your on-premise file share, you just create the bank payment file, and then you save it on-prem. You're done, right? Another on-prem system can pick it up, send it over to the bank. Over here, it's hard because, well, we don't have physical access to a machine anymore because we're in the cloud. So that's a challenge, no access to LSVM. So, because when we talk about the overall architecture, right, we always show Azure Blob in the architectural picture to say, yeah, we do use Azure Blob. But then the question comes, how as an X++ developer, how do I get access at the Azure Blob and be able to save my file there, right? There's actually an API called Shared Service Unit Storage. It's a C# DLL, but you can reference it from X++, and it's got APIs for you to actually save whatever file into the blob storage, right? And then the recommended the solution here is use this API from Shared Service Unit Storage to save that bank payment file in X++, and then write a custom service so that your on-prem application can call, right? On-prem application calls this custom service, and this custom service retrieve the file. Obviously, as a custom service, it's just a whole bunch of X++ code that retrieves the file through, again, the Shared Service Unit Storage API. Retrieve the file, then just beam it down through the retrieve call. Again, this is for getting a file that is not tabular format. If I compare this versus I just want to export some journals, right? Payroll journals out of X into a file. Should you go ahead and write some X++ logic, read the journals, create a file, call this X++ code, save it into the blob storage, put a custom service and have your on-premise application call it to get the file? No. Why? Because that's exactly what DIXF recurring integration job does, right? When you run an export job, we have code, the DIXF firmware code is going to read data from the target payment journal tables, deserialize it into a staging table, and then put it into a file. Sometimes you can even skip the staging table and just go straight to the file. And then we have an API called DQ already for you to interact with operations to retrieve that file. So that entire experience is already available out of the box. Right? So the key differentiation here is payment journal is the standard structured data that we have in the table versus a bank payment file. It's something that we dynamically construct. Right? It's not readily available in the table. Is that clear? No? I know that's why I put it at the end. It is a bit of a quite complex, but I'm hoping it makes sense to some of you. But for those of you it doesn't make sense, come talk to us afterwards. Well, I'll walk it through with you. In terms of landscape, the second part of for the main part of this presentation, we're trying to go through, share with you the real life scenarios that we have worked with our customers with, as Goku has walked you guys through. The second part of this presentation is on talking about integration landscape in general, right? Operation related and just the overall landscape. Over here, we're just looking at a hybrid cloud scenario where you still run part of your business on-prem, you run part of your business in the cloud, right? So we're doing hybrid integration. It's not like all of a sudden you just move all your assets to the cloud. Yeah, keep going. Got it, thanks. This picture, I really like it because hopefully you guys have heard Logic App and BizTalk. Left-hand side is all the connectors that's available for Logic App. The right-hand side is all the Azure services that's available through Logic App. So these Azure services all have connectors into Logic App. In the middle, we have Logic App and BizTalk server, where what that means is we're trying to achieve the better together story, right? The BizTalk server 2016 has built-in support for Logic App, and Logic App has a BizTalk adapter. So these two guys can interact. If you already use, the connector is just for you to reach, for a Logic App to interact with other type of services you have running on-prem or in the cloud. API management and Azure Service Bus are the service infrastructure that would allow you to manage your API and implement integration patterns, and we'll dive into details a little bit more. Yeah. So in terms of BizTalk, like I mentioned, 2016 support for Logic App. The question is, do I need to use Logic App to be able to interact with operations? The answer is no. If you use BizTalk, and you can use BizTalk and BizTalk alone to call the RESTful APIs that we expose out of operations, right? No problem. The only difference you need to do is you need to handle the AAD authentication through a custom behavior, right? That's it. So you don't need a Logic App to be able to interact with Logic App. So our recommendation in terms of BizTalk is if you already have BizTalk running on-prem or any type of other middleware, typical, whatever you run, keep it, right? Because you still have assets running on-premise. So keep that going. You can still use the same middleware to interact with operations because all these APIs we have, are nothing but RESTful endpoint, right? Those middle-tier middleware server will be able to interact with these RESTful APIs. Next, we're going to talk about Service Bus. Service Bus is asynchronous message cloud platform. You can use it to implement your ESB, Enterprise Service Bus patterns. The goal that you're trying to achieve with Service Bus is obviously decoupled communication, reliability, because Service Bus is a platform as a service, so you don't have to run it. It's Microsoft hosted. Obviously, load balancing and buffering in the sense that, say, typical scenario for Service Bus, right? Pub and sub. One publisher publishes millions of messages, and your subscriber maybe is not able to process millions of messages at the speed which your publisher is publishing, right? If you do a peer-to-peer, a point-to-point integration, inevitably you lose some message because this guy is publishing quite a lot of messages. And if you want to get all these messages into your subscriber, it's going to take a while. And then the subscriber might not have the bandwidth to handle these messages. With the Service Bus in between, you're able to buffer these messages because Service Bus is a service. We can handle as many messages as you send us and in how often of a cadence you send us. We'll guarantee that all these messages are not going to get lost. We're going to store it in Service Bus, and then you can choose how often you grab it off of the bus to fed it to the subscriber. Right? Our recommendation to Service Bus is don't go boil the ocean. Now that you're in the cloud, you're excited with all this new cool technology, you're doing your ERP implementation, and then at the same time say, hey, let's re-architect our EIF, our Enterprise Integration Framework as well. Right? That's a very, just very dangerous territory there. Right? Just before you venture out on a project that does both ERP implementation and integration re-architecting at the same time, it's a very hard project to manage if you're trying to do both at the same time. So our recommendation is take an iterative approach. First, just do a lift and shift to get everything to work. And knowing that you might write some integration interface that might get thrown away, which is okay. Go live with that, and then in a second iteration, take a look at what other Azure services and what re-architecting you can do. Yeah, that would be our recommendation in terms of project management. QuadX is, like we talked about, there's two ways to interact with X, right? OData and file-based. File-based, there's 4 different APIs, right? Enqueue, dequeue, job status, and acknowledgement. The best, if you want to, obviously these 4 APIs, you need to have something on-premise, right? If you have some on-premise legacy warehouse application you're running that just export a file, and you need to import it into X for your inventory. You need to write this little client application to do that, right? To do the actual enqueue of that file. So the best application out there is called QuadX. This application is open source. It's written by Tomek, who is one of our great MCS engineer. He has made this open source, and we are working on making this public. We're working on publishing this on GitHub. Thanks to some of you, and Shri got the message because the approval is actually stuck with Shri, and I think he got the message. He actually emailed me today. It's like, hey, Paul, which one do I need to approve? So hopefully we'll get it out there soon. So for those of you guys who did deliver the message, thank you.
Why isn't this part of standard solution?
Yeah. The question is, why is this part of the standard solution? Because this is some application you have to take and run it and host it on-prem. We'll go to Logic App, and then we'll tell you why Logic App is actually our preferred way for integration. Right? So the pros and cons for QuadX. Pros is super easy to configure, super easy to set up. It's free. Cons is because this is a self-hosted solution, so you have to manage it, you have to scale it. Error handling, it's got some built-in error handling, but if you want to change error handling flow, you have to touch code. There's no real-time alerts out of the box, but you can extend it to enable real-time alerts. And there's also the dual scheduling because you have to schedule it once inside of X, and then you have to come to QuadX to schedule it again. The reverse is, the other option is doing a Logic App. Logic App is a iPaaS offering from Microsoft. Integration platform as a service. It offers both cloud and on-premise connectors. It lights up other Azure services like we were talking about on the architectural slides, right? And then how is it relates to operations? The operations connector is available that sits on top of the OData service endpoints. So for all the data entities that not for all, but for most of the data entities we have out of the box, if the is public property is turned to yes, we have OData service endpoint that sits on top of all. And if you go to Logic App today, if you type in Dynamics 365 for operations, you'll see a CRUD connector that connects to all these data entities, right? So you can do CRUD on Logic App. And there's also, last week, we've added an action to be able to execute an OData service endpoint, an OData action on Logic App as well. That means any custom service you've deployed, you will be able to call from Logic App. And there's also the generic HTTP connector you can use because these 4 APIs, right, it's a custom ASP controller. So they're not exposed through our OData. Therefore, these 4 recurring job APIs is not discoverable with our native connector. Right? So you can use, but that doesn't mean you can't use it. You can use the existing HTTP connector to connect to those 4 APIs. And also for Logic App, it's got enterprise integration pack for your BTP workflow if you want to handle EDI document transformation and all that. But obviously that comes with a cost. So I've heard it's quite pricey to use the enterprise integration pack. In terms of pros and cons, it's a service. Scale-wise, manageability-wise, it's nice. Cons, it's not free, and it's only available in the cloud. So I don't know how we're doing on time. I think we have 5 minutes left. Yeah, sure. I don't know if you guys have heard about Microsoft Flow. It's basically, think about it as, compare Flow to Power Apps versus Logic App to writing X++. So Logic App is for your developers, for your critical, mission critical integration, and Flow is for your kind of business process integration from a business user level, right? No code, no nothing. If it fails, it's okay. It's not going to hurt your business. If a failure of an integration is actually going to hurt your business, I would recommend build it on top of Logic App. And we also have a little slider there that compares Flow versus Logic App and goes through, compare when should you use what and why and what the differences between these two. So instead of taking the picture on this one, if you just search Flow versus Logic App, you'll see a very nice blog article that's written on this topic. It compares Logic App, Flow, Web Jobs, and Azure Function, when to use which. So it's really good. I highly recommend you guys to read it. So that concludes our presentation. Any questions? Yes, I saw that hand first.
I'm a little bit confused here as to Logic Apps and CDS, like where do they fit in an integration?
Yes, the question is, how does Logic App fit with CDS? Logic App, at this point, Logic App and all this is more for third-party integration, versus CDS at this point is still a mechanism against which we're working on for our first-party integration, means between sales and operation. That does not mean we're not going to open it up for third-party integration, but currently the team is still using CDS for first-party integration. And Logic App for third-party Logic App, you can still use Logic App for it.
So in the future, we might potentially just use CDS and we might not require Logic Apps. Is that a possibility?
If you are orchestrating a lot of business process, right, across sales, operations, other cloud workload, maybe you have something running on-prem, I don't think CDS is going to be able to orchestrate the whole thing. You will need some kind of middleware to orchestrate that, right?
And also CDS is more of a service on the data that resides beneath. And for any orchestration, as Paul said, you would need Logic Apps or Flow to hydrate CDS.
Yes?
What happened with master data management?
MDM, yes. Are you talking about the 2012 version? Yeah. Yeah, that's a better question, yes. We don't have, to put it just frank, we don't have a similar MDM strategy for operations, right? In terms of if I want to share my master data, customer products, employee contacts, whatever, across across different legal entities on the same operation instance, right? If customer John Smith credit limit changes on company 1, I also want to change it in company 2, right? And I want to keep them synchronized. We don't have that.
That's what value you don't need it. You need it more with all the systems or other instances.
Yep, exactly. So I would argue there are scenarios that deserve synchronization across different legal entities on the same instance, as well as you have multiple instances that you also want to keep them in sync, which our 2012 MDM solution actually supports that. And we support it by having SQL MDS as the hub and then X instances as the spoke. And then your single copy of truth will store in SQL MDS. And obviously SQL MDS provides conflict resolution, detection, all that, admin portal. But for operations, we don't yet have an MDM story.
What is the other approach to integrate such
Yep. So if you look at how we do sales and operations, right, those type of scenarios definitely exist because accounts, products, price list, everything exists on both sides. And if we do enable multi-master mode, inevitably we'll run into conflicts, we'll have to do detections and all that. So in CDS, because that's where we are syncing everything into, right? So I guess it's still being designed by the engineering team how best to handle master data. Yeah, most likely.
For now, yeah. Any more questions? Sorry, go ahead.
Okay. You guys mentioned earlier about authentication using Azure AD. So if I sign on to a Windows 10 device as an Azure AD user, will I do single sign-on into the client automatically for me?
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah.
So if you're...
If you get access to create sales order,
Yes. So where do you want to consume this?
Well, say I use this stuff. The way we do it today, we just send it to AIF, and then we get another message which contains the project, the message ID that the project back to the request, and then we know which cell that you're speaking. Can we do this using?
No. So right now, DXF doesn't do it. So you'll have to do your own call based on the data that you have sent. So for example, you have some kind of integration ID or the document ID that's sitting on the sales order, you query back and get the sales. Yeah. Go ahead.
You guys going to share your logic app to get called?
There's this.
Yeah, we weren't able to. There was a deep dive session yesterday where we actually deep dive into how to create the logic app. We did a demo on logic app and everything. I'd highly encourage you to watch the recording of that. Yes, and we are going to publish the logic app template itself, plus all the X++ code we have written on GitHub, hopefully within the next couple of weeks.
I do have a second question. It's kind of different thing. So, like, recurring integrations are great when you run on schedule. Let's say you have a scenario where some business process is running within 365 for operational platform. When somebody hits a button, you want to kick off one of those big jobs and save a file to the cloud. I don't think there's an easy way to just say run this recurring job and put it in the queue without kind of copying some base stuff. This is more like a question.
Yeah. You're right. There's no very good way to, if you're doing this through Logic App, you can definitely build that trigger in. You can also, because the source system actually owns the dropping the file, the action of dropping that file, right?
I'm being executing the prompt that even puts the message in the queue.
Right. Yep. So out of the box, the Logic App monitors an on-premise folder, right? If you put the file there, boom, it's gonna, depends on how often you run it, it's gonna, once you run it, it's gonna take the file up, right? So if you do have control when to put this file in this folder.
I'm talking about NAX generating a file going
Oh, this is export. Huh.
not on a schedule, but
Yes, we do have an API you can call
Yeah.
to do the export.
Yeah, that can be done. The only difference is if you have a recurring job, you know the blob ID based on the GUID. In this case, you need to use the shared DLL service to get the blob ID.
There is an API called export to file.
Yeah,
Right?
there is
You can
export
call.
to file too.
There's an API you can call.
it'll just call it'll run the integration right then.
Yes.
Yeah, your classes basically.
Look into, remember if you do an export now, that's essentially what it calls behind the scene.
Yeah.
So, and that's all X++. You can check it out.
Is there a logical data model for all the entities that we share with our application partners?
Logical data model for the entities. Yeah.
Schema.
I guess in the data management workspace, there's a target entity tile. If you click on the target entity
get the
tile,
list
you
of-
have the mapping of how we do the mapping from entities to target tables and all that.
But you have to go entity by entity.
But they don't really need it down to the table. What they need to understand is how the entities are connected with each other. So
Oh.
they can at the end understand the behaviors and something.
Yeah.
So you want to know the primary table behind the entity or something.
Not necessarily. It's just the customer data entity and sales order data
Yeah.
entity. How it relates to each other. Let's say warehouse.
Yeah, so there's a template option in DIXF. So if you look at the data management session from this morning recording, we spoke about how templates can help you discover all the other entities related to a particular entity. Okay.
Other questions? All right. Thank
Okay,
you.
thanks all.